Han Soo-yeon woke up before dawn, just as she did every day. The small room she shared with her younger brother was cold, and the sound of rain tapping against the window made everything feel even lonelier. She glanced at the clock. 5 a.m. It was time to start her day. The smile she used to give her mother as she left for work seemed more tired each day, but she couldn't show weakness. She had to be strong for her family, especially since her father's bankruptcy had left them in poverty. Soo-yeon quickly dressed in her delivery uniform, grabbed her old jacket, and quietly left the house. As she walked through the wet streets of Seoul, her mind was preoccupied with thoughts of how to pay the bills for the next month. Her mother was sick and needed expensive medication, and her brother was still in school, which meant more expenses. Soo-yeon felt overwhelmed, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. She had to keep moving forward. Arriving at the small eatery where she worked, she was greeted with a smile by the owner, a kind old man who knew about her difficult situation. "You always arrive before your shift, Soo-yeon. You're going to end up sick, girl," he remarked as she put on her helmet and prepared her delivery bag. "Juicy, I don't have time to get sick," Soo-yeon replied, forcing a smile. "And you know I need the extra hours." With that, she climbed onto her motorbike and set off for another day of work. Seoul was already awake, with people rushing everywhere, going about their busy lives. For Soo-yeon, it was just another day of struggle. Meanwhile, in the most luxurious part of the city, Kang Ji-hoon was waking up in his penthouse. Unlike Soo-yeon, he had no financial worries, but his life was no less complicated. At 28 years old, Ji-hoon was the heir to the largest corporate conglomerate in Korea, but he carried a weight no one else could see. His relationship with his father, the rigid and demanding President Kang, was based on expectations and responsibilities. Ji-hoon had been raised to be the perfect successor, molded for power and coldness in business. Sitting at his breakfast table, surrounded by luxury and assistants, Ji-hoon read through the day's financial reports. To him, work was all he knew. Happiness? That was something he considered an illusion, created by those who didn't understand the true value of life. His driver was waiting for him at the building's entrance, and Ji-hoon left without saying a word. He was on his way to an important meeting, but the torrential rain over Seoul had turned traffic into chaos. Even so, he didn't seem concerned. After all, nothing in his life was out of control. Across the city, Soo-yeon was making her last delivery of the day in a wealthy neighborhood where the houses looked like palaces. Every time she came here, she felt a mixture of fascination and sadness. How can some people have so much while others have so little? She thought, as she walked with the food box in hand. The rain caught her by surprise, and without an umbrella, she ran for cover into a fancy cafe. As soon as she entered, bumping into people as she tried to dry herself, she accidentally ran into someone. Without realizing the gravity of what had happened, she mumbled a quick, "sorry," and continued drying her soaked hair with her hands. On the other side, Kang Ji-hoon looked at her in disbelief. Used to being treated with deference and respect, he couldn't believe that someone, especially a mere delivery girl, had dared to bump into him without even looking him in the eye. "Aren't you going to apologize properly?" His voice came out cold and firm, full of arrogance. Soo-yeon glanced at him quickly, not recognizing the powerful man standing in front of her. To her, he was just another annoyed customer. "Sorry again," she said impatiently and turned toward the door, ready to face the rain once more. Ji-hoon stood there, shocked. No one had ever treated him with such indifference. He was Kang Ji-hoon, heir to Kang Enterprises. Accustomed to being revered wherever he went, the fact that she had ignored him so completely bothered him deeply. He watched her leave, feeling a mix of irritation and something else he couldn't quite identify. Why had this encounter affected him so much? She was just a stranger. As he left the cafe and got into the car, Ji-hoon stared at the rain falling against the window, his mind stuck on that moment. The young delivery girl, with her indifferent and tired posture, seemed to be one of the few people who had no idea who he was. And for some reason, that piqued his curiosity. Soo-yeon, on the other hand, had already forgotten the incident. To her, Ji-hoon was just another arrogant customer she had crossed paths with. Her focus was on getting home to take care of her mother. Another long night awaited her. Back in his penthouse, Ji-hoon was still thinking about the unexpected encounter. The way she had simply moved on without caring who he was left him feeling unsettled. There was something about her, a strength, perhaps a determination, that he had never encountered before. And it irritated him as much as it intrigued him. As both of them returned to their opposite lives, the rain continued to fall over Seoul, like a sign that something was about to change. The days passed, but Kang Ji-hoon couldn't get the young delivery girl out of his mind. It wasn't common for someone to leave such a strong impression on him, especially someone from a world so different from his. He didn't know her name, where she worked, or any details about her. But the way she had ignored him, as if he were just an ordinary person, continued to disturb him. Ji-hoon was used to being treated with reverence and admiration, and Soo-yeon's casual disregard had touched something in his ego. At the office, Ji-hoon tried to focus on financial reports and meetings with the company's executives, but from time to time, his mind wandered back to that moment in the cafe. Why was he still thinking about her? He couldn't explain it, but that encounter had left a mark. Maybe it was the contrast between his luxurious life and her busy, simple one. Or maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, he had met someone who didn't care about his status. One rainy morning, while going over some documents, Ji-hoon, frustrated by his inability to forget her, tried to convince himself that this was just a passing curiosity. He was used to solving all his problems with money. Why was this encounter bothering him so much? He tried to distract himself with work, but the memory of her indifference continued to haunt him. A few days later, Ji-hoon, without any clear reason, decided to do something he rarely did: go out alone. He told his driver to drop him off in a busy part of the city. Walking through Seoul like a regular citizen, without bodyguards or luxury cars, seemed like a way to escape the pressures of his name. He wanted to observe people and perhaps understand a little more about what ordinary life was like. Meanwhile, Soo-yeon was working an afternoon shift at the small cafe where she took part-time jobs. She didn't particularly enjoy the work, but she was grateful for it. The salary barely covered basic expenses, and every tip was a welcome relief. Between serving customers and cleaning tables, Soo-yeon kept herself busy, trying not to think about the problems waiting for her at home. That day, as if fate had planned it, Ji-hoon, casually strolling through the city, walked into the very same cafe where Soo-yeon was working. He didn't notice her immediately, and she, immersed in her tasks, didn't see him either. Ji-hoon, unaware of who was there, sat at one of the tables in the back, looking at the menu with little interest. For him, it was just a break from his walk among ordinary people. When Soo-yeon finally approached to take his order, the shock was mutual. She froze when she recognized him, her mind racing to remember where she had seen him before. Then, like a flash, she recalled the incident in the cafe. He, on the other hand, was equally surprised to see her, though his expression remained cold. "You again," he muttered, watching her with interest. Soo-yeon, unsure of his reaction, just nodded and pulled out her notepad, trying to stay composed. "Are you going to order something, or are you just staring?" she replied, her voice tinged with fatigue. He watched her closely, noticing the dark circles under her eyes and the hurried way she worked. Something in him softened for a moment. "Just a coffee, please," he said without his usual arrogance. Soo-yeon wrote down the order and quickly walked away, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling of being near him again. She didn't know who he was, but by the way he dressed and the attitude he exuded, Soo-yeon knew he came from a completely different world, one she honestly didn't want to understand. Ji-hoon watched her every move as he waited for his coffee. There was something different about this young woman that intrigued him. She seemed so burdened, yet there was an undeniable strength in the way she carried herself. For a moment, he wondered what it would be like to live her life. A life without the weight of corporate expectations, but with other struggles he had never known. When Soo-yeon returned with the coffee, he observed her more carefully, but this time, without the coldness from before. "Have you worked here for long?" he asked, trying to hide his curiosity. She glanced at him, surprised that he was trying to make conversation. "None of your business," she responded without hesitation, grabbing a cloth to wipe the table next to him. Ji-hoon, used to being treated with reverence, was once again shocked by Soo-yeon's directness. But instead of getting irritated, he chuckled softly, something rare for him. "You're different," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Soo-yeon looked at him again, now irritated. "Whether that's a compliment or a criticism, I don't know, but I'm busy. If you don't need anything else, I'll get back to work." Without waiting for a response, she left, leaving Ji-hoon alone with his thoughts. The man, still surprised by his own reaction, sat there, watching her from a distance. The more he looked, the more he realized he couldn't fit her into any stereotype he had of the people around him. She didn't care about his wealth, didn't treat him with deference, and even without knowing who he was, she seemed to see him as just another ordinary person. Something he had never experienced before in his life. At the end of her shift, Soo-yeon was exhausted. All she wanted was to go home, take care of her mother, and rest. But as she left the cafe, she found Ji-hoon leaning against his car, waiting for her. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her. "Are you following me?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise and discomfort. Ji-hoon looked at her, still grappling with his own feelings. "I just wanted to know your name." Soo-yeon hesitated. She didn't know what to make of this strange man who kept appearing in her life without explanation, but something about him intrigued her, even though she didn't want to admit it. "Han Soo-yeon," she finally said, deciding there was no harm in giving her name. Ji-hoon smiled, satisfied with her answer. "Kang Ji-hoon?" He introduced himself, unaware that the powerful name meant nothing to her. Then, without saying anything else, he got into his car and left, leaving Soo-yeon standing in the rain, wondering what was happening. For Ji-hoon, this was just the beginning of something he couldn't yet define. For Soo-yeon, it was the start of an encounter that, unbeknownst to her, would change her life forever. The days following that strange encounter between Kang Ji-hoon and Han Soo-yeon were intense, although neither of them was willing to admit it. Ji-hoon, back in his routine of corporate meetings, business dinners, and a life surrounded by luxury, couldn't shake Soo-yeon from his thoughts. He didn't understand why he felt so drawn to this young woman who lived in a reality so different from his own. But every time he thought of her, something inside him seemed to soften. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. However, Ji-hoon was used to living according to his family's expectations. He knew that any involvement with someone like Soo-yeon would be unthinkable in the eyes of his father, the powerful President Kang. His father had always made it clear that Ji-hoon should marry someone of similar status, preferably within the restricted circle of heirs and heiresses of major conglomerates. Ji-hoon had grown up believing that happiness was a luxury he couldn't afford to pursue. But now he was beginning to question that belief. On the other hand, Soo-yeon was also restless. She couldn't understand why this mysterious, arrogant man, Kang Ji-hoon, seemed so interested in her. They had nothing in common, and she didn't need complications in her life. Her mother was getting sicker, and the medical bills were piling up. Soo-yeon could barely survive with her 2 jobs, and any emotional distraction was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet, every time she closed her eyes at night, the memory of Ji-hoon haunted her. There was something in his gaze, something behind that cold and distant facade, that made her heart race. She couldn't forget the way he had asked for her name, as if it truly mattered to him. A week after their encounter at the cafe, Soo-yeon was making another one of her deliveries in a wealthy neighborhood. When she arrived at the address, she was surprised to see Ji-hoon stepping out of the building. He seemed equally surprised to see her there, but he didn't hesitate to approach her. "You again?" he said, a slight smile playing at the corner of his lips. Soo-yeon rolled her eyes, feeling uncomfortable with the sudden meeting. "I work around here. I don't have time for chit-chat." Before she could turn around, Ji-hoon spoke quickly, trying to stop her from leaving. "Let me drive you home today." She turned, surprised. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." "Exactly," he replied. "I want to get to know you." Soo-yeon looked at him suspiciously. There was something about the sincerity in his eyes that made her hesitate. Ji-hoon, so used to being avoided for his coldness, didn't expect his words to have such an impact. But there she was, standing still, considering his offer. After a long pause, she sighed, exhausted. I'll accept the ride, but only because I'm tired. And this doesn't mean I want to get involved in anything complicated. Ji-hoon simply nodded, opening the car door for her. The drive to Soo-yeon's house was marked by a comfortable silence. Ji-hoon didn't ask any questions, simply driving calmly through the streets of Seoul. Soo-yeon stared out the window, wondering what she was doing in the car of a man like him. Part of her wanted to believe this was just a coincidence, that after this ride, their lives would go back to normal. But another part of her, deeper inside, knew that something was changing. When they arrived at Soo-yeon's house, she thanked him politely and got out of the car. Ji-hoon remained still for a moment, looking at the simple, modest home where she lived. Soo-yeon's life was so far removed from his that it felt like a parallel universe. "Good night, Soo-yeon," he said, as she walked to the door. She turned for a second, slightly surprised that he used her name so naturally. "Good night, Ji-hoon," she replied hesitantly before going inside. She closed the door and leaned against the wall, feeling her heart racing. Why did he make her feel like this? Meanwhile, Ji-hoon drove back to his penthouse, still thinking about her. He knew his interest in Soo-yeon went beyond simple curiosity. She made him feel human in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. However, when he returned to his luxurious apartment, Ji-hoon was confronted by a reality he couldn't ignore. His father, President Kang, was sitting in the living room wearing his usual stern and cold expression. "I heard you've been spending time with a delivery girl," he said disdainfully. Ji-hoon felt his entire body tense. How had his father found out so quickly? He tried to remain calm. "That's none of your business, father." "Of course it's my business," his father retorted, his voice filled with authority. "You can't get involved with a girl like that. Not only because she's beneath you socially, but also because her family is tied to our past." Ji-hoon frowned. "What do you mean by that?" His father let out a sigh as if about to reveal a long-kept secret. "That girl's family, Han Soo-yeon, was destroyed by a decision I made. Her father was a promising businessman, but he made bad deals with our company and lost everything. I didn't hesitate to take everything from him to protect our empire." The shock hit Ji-hoon like a bolt of lightning. Soo-yeon's story, her fight for survival, began to make sense in a way he hadn't expected. He stood abruptly, unable to process the truth. "You ruined her life?" Ji-hoon asked, his voice rising with anger. "It was a business decision." His father responded coldly. "And you, as my successor, must learn to do the same." But Ji-hoon couldn't accept that. For the first time in a long time, he felt something break inside him. He couldn't look at Soo-yeon the same way now, knowing that his family was responsible for her suffering. And even worse, he realized that his feelings for her were growing, even though everything seemed wrong. Without saying another word, Ji-hoon left the house, determined to figure out how to deal with all of this. Inside him, a battle was brewing between his duty to his family and the deep feelings he was beginning to have for Soo-yeon. Kang Ji-hoon couldn't stop thinking about what his father had revealed. The idea that the downfall of Han Soo-yeon's family was directly caused by his own family's actions left him shocked. He always knew Kang Enterprises made ruthless business decisions, but he never imagined it would personally affect someone who had begun to mean so much to him. The conflict inside him grew as his feelings for Soo-yeon deepened. But now, knowing that his father was responsible for her family's downfall, everything seemed more complicated. Meanwhile, Soo-yeon continued her life, unaware of the secret that connected their families. To her, Ji-hoon was simply a mysterious, wealthy, and unattainable man who, for some reason, had shown interest in her. His attention made her uncomfortable, but also caused her heart to race. She couldn't deny that there was something different about him, something that made her feel a connection. Yet, she knew their worlds were too far apart for anything real to happen. As Ji-hoon struggled with the weight of his revelation, the intrigue surrounding them intensified. Kang Min-ah, his ambitious cousin and secondary heir to the Kang Empire, was closely watching his every move. Minna had always been infatuated with Ji-hoon and hoped to one day marry him. She was calculating and determined, knowing how to play the game of power within the family like no one else. However, she knew that Ji-hoon's heart was closed and inaccessible to any kind of affection. He always saw her as family, never as something more. Upon discovering that Ji-hoon was interested in an ordinary girl, Minna felt a wave of jealousy and rage. How could he ignore her? A woman with everything: wealth, beauty, and power, and chase after a poor, insignificant girl. It was an insult to everything she believed in as the natural order of things. Determined not to lose Ji-hoon, Minna began to plot. She knew President Kang would never approve of a relationship between Ji-hoon and Soo-yeon, and she intended to use this to her advantage. Additionally, Minna had her own cards to play: information that could destroy any chance Soo-yeon had of getting closer to Ji-hoon. While Minna schemed, Soo-yeon, unaware of the looming danger, received devastating news. Her mother's health was rapidly deteriorating, and the doctors recommended urgent and expensive treatment, something completely beyond her financial reach. Soo-yeon fell into despair. With the wages from her 2 jobs, she barely managed to cover basic expenses. Now, with this new burden, she felt completely powerless. Desperate, Soo-yeon began to consider making sacrifices she had never thought she would have to make. She didn't know where to turn or what to do. Each day, her mother grew weaker, and time seemed to be running out. Amid this emotional turmoil, Ji-hoon couldn't stand the silence any longer. He needed to talk to Soo-yeon, to confess what he had learned about their families. One night, he showed up unexpectedly at Soo-yeon's house, hoping to find the courage to tell her everything. She opened the door and stared at him, surprised and confused to see him there. Rain lightly fell over Ji-hoon, and his expression was serious, as if he was about to reveal something important. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. Soo-yeon observed him for a moment, sensing that something was wrong. Even though she was exhausted from all the problems at home, something in Ji-hoon's expression made her anxious. She nodded and invited him in, though hesitantly. The small living room in Soo-yeon's home was modest, almost bare. Ji-hoon, accustomed to luxury, couldn't help but notice the simplicity of everything around him, which only increased his guilt. "There's something I found out," Ji-hoon started, trying to gather his thoughts. "My family, my company, was responsible for your father's bankruptcy." The world seemed to stop for Soo-yeon in that moment. She stood in silence, processing what he had just said. Ji-hoon's words hung in the air, heavy as stones. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely audible, filled with disbelief. "My father made deals with yours, and when your family's business started having trouble, my father made decisions to protect our empire, without caring about what would happen to your family. That's what led to your father's downfall." Soo-yeon felt a wave of emotions: shock, anger, sadness. She looked at Ji-hoon, trying to understand how someone who had begun to mean something to her could be tied to the worst moment of her life. Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she held them back. She didn't want to show weakness, not in front of him. "So that's it," she said, her voice forced to remain calm. "Your family destroyed mine, and now what? You want apologies? Pity?" Ji-hoon shook his head, desperate. "No, Soo-yeon. I didn't know about this until now, and I'm so sorry. I wish things were different." Soo-yeon stood abruptly. "You think that just because you feel sorry, that changes anything? My family lost everything. My mother is dying because we can't afford proper treatment. And now you come here with your perfect life, saying your family destroyed mine like it was some accident." Ji-hoon tried to approach her, but Soo-yeon stepped back, raising her hand. "Number, I don't want anything from you. I can't see you anymore." The silence that followed was painful for both of them. Ji-hoon, who had never felt such a heavy burden in his life, stood there, unable to find the right words. Finally, he nodded, resigned, and left the house. Outside, the rain fell harder now. mixing with the tears that streamed down Ji-hoon's face. He knew in that moment that he had lost something precious. Not just Soo-yeon, but any chance of redeeming the mistake his family had made. Meanwhile, in her luxurious penthouse, Minna waited with a malicious smile. She knew the relationship between Ji-hoon and Soo-yeon was doomed to fail, and she was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that happened. But for Ji-hoon, what had begun as a tumultuous relationship filled with obstacles now seemed to have reached its end. The love he had begun to feel for Soo-yeon was suffocated by a dark secret, and he didn't know if there was any way to fix things. The days following the confrontation between Kang Ji-hoon and Han Soo-yeon were devastating for both of them. Soo-yeon, consumed by anger and pain, decided to cut all ties with Ji-hoon. She couldn't forgive the fact that his family, the source of all her suffering, was directly responsible for the destruction of her own family. It felt as though her world had closed in on her even more. Beyond the pressure of caring for her mother, she now had to deal with the realization that the man who had made her feel something again was tied to everything bad that had happened in her life. Soo-yeon tried to focus on work and her daily responsibilities, but with every delivery she made, with every coffee she served, the image of Ji-hoon haunted her. She wondered if, in another scenario, things could have been different. Yet, she quickly pushed these thoughts away, knowing that their lives were destined to remain apart. Ji-hoon, on the other hand, was heartbroken. He had grown up in a world where power and money solved all problems, but for the first time, he faced something he couldn't control. The pain of losing Soo-yeon was immense, but he knew he couldn't blame her for it. His father, the man he had always admired for his strength and determination, now represented the cause of all of Soo-yeon's suffering. And this reality tore him apart inside. Ji-hoon's days became bleak. Corporate meetings and the affairs of the family business were nothing more than a meaningless distraction, and he could barely focus on anything. The memory of Soo-yeon's pained words and her broken expression haunted him day and night. He knew he had to do something to fix the wrong his family had done, but he didn't know where to start. More than that, he felt that any chance of being with her was lost. Meanwhile, Soo-yeon's mother's health continued to deteriorate. The doctors became increasingly desperate, recommending a treatment that was urgent and incredibly expensive, something completely out of Soo-yeon's financial reach. She felt as though time was running out. With the meager wages from her 2 jobs, she could barely cover basic expenses. And now, with this new need, she felt utterly helpless. In the midst of all this emotional turmoil, Ji-hoon made a decision. He couldn't just let things remain as they were. He couldn't stand by while the person he loved suffered without doing anything. Determined to help Soo-yeon, even if she never forgave him, he began thinking of ways to use his resources and influence to save her mother's life. It was the least he could do, even if it wasn't enough to fix the damage his family had caused. One evening, Ji-hoon decided to confront his father. He entered the luxurious conference room where President Kang was reviewing company contracts without ceremony, determined to lay his intentions bare. "Father, I need to talk to you," Ji-hoon began, his voice firm. The president looked at him with the same stern, cold expression. "Now is not the time, Ji-hoon. I have more important matters to attend to." "This can't wait." Ji-hoon stepped closer to the table, his eyes filled with anger. "You destroyed a family's life, the family of the woman I love, and now her mother is dying because they can't afford proper treatment." President Kang remained calm, watching his son with a disapproving look. "Business is business, Ji-hoon. We can't afford to think about personal consequences. And this girl, do you really think she's suitable for you? You're a Kang. You should marry someone of your level. This has nothing to do with her level." Ji-hoon exploded. "You don't understand, father. This family lost everything because of you, and I won't stand by while her mother dies because of it. I'm going to use the family's money to help." President Kang laughed, a dry, emotionless sound. "You're letting your feelings cloud your judgment. This isn't love, Ji-hoon. This is weakness." Ji-hoon stood still for a moment, his heart heavy. For the first time in his life, he realized that he didn't want to be like his father. He didn't want to be someone who put business above all else, sacrificing people and emotions for power. If this is weakness, then I'd rather be weak, Ji-hoon replied, his voice steady. I'm going to help Soo-yeon, and if that means going against you, then so be it. Ji-hoon left the room before his father could respond. He knew the cost of defying President Kang would be high, but he no longer cared. He was willing to sacrifice his position, his inheritance, even his name, to do the right thing. He knew this was his only chance to fix what had been broken. A few days later, Soo-yeon received an unexpected call from the hospital. Her mother's treatment had been paid for in full, and she was being transferred to one of the best medical centers in the city. Confused and in shock, Soo-yeon rushed to the hospital, unable to understand how this had happened. When she arrived, the doctor handed her a document with the name of the payer, Kang Ji-hoon. Her heart sank. Part of her felt an indescribable relief, but another part of her was furious. How dare he help her after everything? Did he think money could solve the problem? That it could buy her forgiveness? That night, Soo-yeon went to Ji-hoon's apartment. It was raining heavily, and she was soaked when she arrived at his door. Ji-hoon opened immediately, surprised to see her there. But before he could say anything, she interrupted him. Why did you do this? Soo-yeon asked, her voice trembling with both anger and emotion. Do you think just because you paid for my mother's treatment that this erases everything your family did? Ji-hoon looked at her, his eyes full of regret. I didn't do it to erase anything. I did it because I care about you. And I couldn't stand by while your mother suffered. I know this doesn't fix the past, but it was the only way I could help. Soo-yeon was silent for a moment, fighting back tears. She wanted to hate him, wanted to push him out of her life, but something inside her stopped her. She knew Ji-hoon had sacrificed everything for her, and that touched her deeply. This doesn't change what happened, she said, her voice breaking. But thank you for helping my mother. Ji-hoon nodded, relieved that she, at least, accepted his help. But he knew the road to forgiveness would be long and filled with obstacles. That night, Soo-yeon left without saying anything else, leaving Ji-hoon alone with his thoughts. He knew he had taken the first step, but he also knew that earning her forgiveness and trust again would be an even harder battle. The days following the conversation between Kang Ji-hoon and Han Soo-yeon were filled with tension and uncertainty. Soo-yeon was torn. On the one hand, Ji-hoon's help had saved her mother's life, and she knew that without him, she never would have been able to afford the treatment. On the other hand, the weight of the past still hung heavily between them, and the resentment she felt over the destruction of her family hadn't lessened. She knew she couldn't simply forgive Ji-hoon, but she also couldn't push him out of her thoughts. While Soo-yeon struggled with her emotions, Ji-hoon was fighting a different battle. After his decision to help Soo-yeon, he cut ties with his father. President Kang, furious at his son's disobedience, removed Ji-hoon from the company, stripping him of all the privileges he had as heir. Ji-hoon accepted the consequences without protest, fully aware that his relationship with Soo-yeon and his feelings for her were more important than the corporate empire his family had built. Now, Ji-hoon was on a new path. For the first time in his life, he was alone, without the financial support or influence of Kang Enterprises. He rented a modest apartment and started exploring ways to use his knowledge to build something on his own, far from his father's shadow. Without telling Soo-yeon, he wanted to prove to himself that he could achieve something independently and that he could create a life beyond the confines of his family's name. Meanwhile, Soo-yeon remained focused on her mother's recovery. After weeks of intensive treatment, her mother was finally starting to show signs of improvement. Her health, which had deteriorated so quickly, was stabilizing at last. Soo-yeon felt immense gratitude for this, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling of indebtedness to Ji-hoon. She didn't want to admit it, but her feelings for him still lingered, like a flame that refused to die, no matter how much she tried to ignore it. Their lives seemed to be running on parallel tracks until a new twist of fate brought them together once again. One afternoon, Soo-yeon was at the hospital with her mother when she saw a piece of news that shocked her. Kang Enterprises was facing a major financial crisis. Several investors had pulled their support after a series of bad decisions, and the empire that President Kang had built over decades was on the verge of collapse. She saw Ji-hoon's name mentioned in the report, but not in connection to the scandal. It seemed that the crisis had worsened shortly after his departure from the company. A wave of concern for Ji-hoon washed over her. Despite everything between their families, Soo-yeon knew that Ji-hoon had sacrificed for her and that he was now paying the price. This realization weighed on her heart, and she wondered if she should reach out to him, at least to see how he was. Before she could make a decision, Ji-hoon came to find her. One evening, he appeared once again at Soo-yeon's house. He looked different, more humble, more serene, but still with that determined look she knew so well. He explained the situation briefly, without complaining about what he had lost. To Ji-hoon, his future at Kang Enterprises no longer mattered. What mattered now was fixing what was broken between them. "Soo-yeon," he began, his voice softer than ever. "I know I can't erase what happened. I know the pain you feel won't just disappear. But even though my world has fallen apart, I'll never stop fighting for you." She looked at him, surprised by his sincerity. He had lost so much because of her, yet here he was, willing to face her with his head held high. The silence between them was filled with unspoken feelings, with emotions both of them had tried to suppress for so long. "I never asked you to fight for me," Soo-yeon replied, her voice trembling. "But you did it anyway, and I don't know what to do with that." Ji-hoon moved closer, keeping a respectful distance but looking directly into her eyes. "I'm not here to ask you for anything, Soo-yeon. I just want you to know that if you ever decide to give me a chance, I'll be waiting. And even if you don't, I'll always be here if you need me." Soo-yeon felt her heart race. It was hard to ignore the impact of his words. For so long, she had tried to convince herself that she could move on without him. But now, seeing the man Ji-hoon had become, a man who had sacrificed so much for her resolve began to waver. A few days later, while reflecting on her feelings, Soo-yeon began to realize that she had been consumed by her own bitterness, and that perhaps she had been clinging to anger that no longer served her. Ji-hoon was not his father. He wasn't directly responsible for what happened to her family, and he had done everything in his power to correct what he could. Maybe it was time to let that barrier down. With her mother's health stabilizing, Soo-yeon made a decision she had been postponing for a long time. She went to Ji-hoon's new apartment. When he opened the door, surprised to see her, she gave him a gentle smile. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive everything, Ji-hoon," she began, her voice soft but firm. "But I'm willing to try, to start over. For real this time." Ji-hoon's eyes filled with a mixture of relief and hope. He didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled her into a hug, something she finally accepted without hesitation. In that moment, between two people from such different worlds, the love that had grown between them finally had a chance to blossom. In the months that followed, Ji-hoon and Soo-yeon began building a new life together. He, now free from the pressures of his family, started a small business using his management skills to create a sustainable company. Soo-yeon, on the other hand, managed to balance her work and taking care of her mother, who was slowly recovering. Together, they learned to value the simple things in life, moments of connection and simplicity, far from the grand responsibilities and ghosts of the past. Ji-hoon had chosen love over power, and Soo-yeon, after so much suffering, finally allowed herself to be loved without fear. Thus, the poor girl who won the heart of the richest man in town ends not with great twists, but with the realization that true love, when genuine, can overcome the hardest obstacles and finds its strength in simplicity and the courage to move forward together. And so we come to the end. If you were moved by the poor girl who won the heart of the richest man in town, don't forget to leave your comment. We want to know what you thought of the characters, the tense moments, and the exciting twists. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next episodes. Share this drama with your friends and help us reach even more people until the next video.